After weeks of YouTube updates, Senator Reinert provides an in-studio assessment of damages to Duluth, just as the governor asked for a disaster declaration from the president. Details in Capitol Report. Hello everybody and welcome to this week's Capitol Report. I'm Julie Bartkey. The images of the Duluth disaster area were far-reaching. Senator Reinert took the opportunity to show the world what was happening in his backyard via social media. The state senator began posting regular updates on YouTube in an effort to bring the images to life. Senator Reinert joined us on the Capitol Report set to discuss what's next for the Duluth area. For many of us, what happened in Duluth with the flash floods was nothing more than an event that we saw on television. But for Senator Reinert, a Duluth resident, it was much more. He's here now to explain the impacts and his work as a legislator. Senator, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let's begin with, you've toured the area. We've all seen the pictures.
Sure.
What's impacted you the most of the flooding?
I think what's been most impactful was how site-specific it was throughout the community. You know, we have these images that everyone has seen. You know, much of the community was relatively undamaged, but areas that were hit were really hard. Take, for instance, me. I live in the hillside below Anger Tower. It's a popular landmark a lot of people know. My home, I had some water in the basement, but nothing too devastating. I have a creek that runs by my house that was full, but we didn't have erosion or collapsing. But I could go blocks in either direction and see just, you know, severe damage. In fact, I spent most of the day of the storm at a friend's place right below one of our parks that had a catastrophic collapse and turned the street into a raging river.
So when you were looking at it, how do you even describe what you saw and try to make it real for those of us who are hundreds of miles away?
Sure. Well, imagine walking through just a really fast-moving river. I mean, that was me trying to cross the avenue to get from where I could park to where my friend's building was. And then throw in 10+% incline, as much of the hillside in Duluth has. So now you have this force of water, 10+ inches in 24 hours. And I think the thing that I've tried to stress to people is it wasn't just that. We'd also had 8 inches in the 5 days before. So we had nearly 17 inches of rain in less than a week and a half in Duluth. So, and we're rock and we're clay. Water can't go anywhere other than down the hill towards the lake. So you had lumber, you had tree branches, you had rocks of this size being thrown down the hill by the force of the water, and you're just getting pelted with this. You know, we were trying to move people's cars off the hillside and try and save cars, and we were 50-50. We got a couple and we lost a couple, but it was just streets turned into rivers, raging rivers. It was something that I never expected to see in Duluth. In fact, I wrote an email to legislators, and I said, you know, never in my life did I think Duluth could flood, but it can and it did. And, you know, now we're in the aftermath phase.
And before we talk about what that means for you as a legislator, I just wanted to point out that you took a really unique perspective and used social media, YouTube in particular, to essentially talk to your constituents and show some of the damage from the get-go. First of all, where'd you get the idea, or what precipitated it? And talk about the reaction. It seems to be just, it seems to have exploded, gone viral.
Well, it's been great. And where does the idea come from? Owning an iPhone. I mean, it's so easy to shoot a little video clip. And in fact, it started as an afterthought. It was the day of the storm, fighting through this river, trying to help, trying to work on things. And I thought, I can't believe what I'm seeing. And others who are not here are not going to be able to believe this. Let's take a minute clip and put it out there and let people see. And it did. It got a lot of hits. A lot of people saw it. And we thought this is a great example, or a great way that we can continue to talk about this. So when we were at the zoo the next day, we did a little bit of a clip. When we were back at Cascade Park in the center of town, when we were back there and the water was gone, did another clip just to show people what the aftermath looked like. And you know, we've used that continually now to talk about what can you do if you're interested in volunteering, what can you do if you'd like to donate. And it's a great way, especially with Facebook and with YouTube, to get something out there, and even with links in emails to get information out there that, you know, at a minute it's pretty digestible for most people in the workday or at home.
Now, when the impacts of the flooding were first being felt, how did you react, not just as a person and a resident, but as a legislator? How long did it take that part of your brain to kick in and think, what am I going to have to do here?
Sure, probably 2 days. I mean, day one was helping friends and helping strangers, just helping people that were being directly impacted. I remember coming home at the end of that first day, and like I said, I have a house that has a creek right next to it, and thinking, oh my gosh, what if the creek overflows at my house? I mean, I hadn't given any of my own personal things much thought yet. Then the next day was just trying to put pieces back together. And it was sort of the end of that next day when it was like, and you could digest the scope of the impact, that you started to go, wow, I mean, this is going to be federal disaster, state declaration. This is probably going to be a special session with so much public infrastructure damaged. And then, of course, it was individual constituents that were being impacted. Where do they go? How do they get help? And I really want to commend the governor, and I want to commend the commissioners, especially Commissioner Rothman from Commerce, who the day after here's a whole packet of information on insurance. How do you work with your insurance provider? What if you don't have insurance? And as a legislator, we know a little about a lot of things. We're not experts in a lot of areas. All that is helpful to me and to the staff here to try and help people when they're calling in and don't know where to start.
So from a legislative perspective, what's next for you? FEMA has already toured. The governor has been up there. So where do you take it from here?
Our next big process is to finish the assessment, and we're just about there so that we can say to the federal government, here is the cost of the impact. We have about $100 million just within the city of Duluth. You go just south of us to Thompson, to Jay Cook State Park. Highway 210 alone probably has $25 million in damage. We need to get all of that put together, including Barnum and Moose Lake and all of those communities, so we can say to the federal government as a region, here's what the impact was. Then hopefully we have the declaration from the president of a disaster area, and then we can start moving forward in the federal funds, matching it with the state funds. And of course, that's when we'd have hopefully a special session to put together that package.
And given the scope of the destruction, I think it's a fair assessment that you're going to want these things to happen sooner rather than later. So give me a timeline. What do you think is realistic here?
Well, hopefully we'll have the assessment finished within the next week, maybe as early as the start of next week. We'll get that information out to the federal government. I'm not sure what their timeline is. We're going to ask, of course, for a turnaround as quickly as possible. If we look back a couple years ago to what happened in Owatonna, we had about a 2-month time span from the date of the incident until we had that one-day special session to accept those federal dollars, pair them with the state dollars, and get those out. So I think that for most of us, that's probably the timeline we envision ourselves being on.
And what about a timeline to actually get working on cleanup, repairing roads? I would imagine it's already begun, right?
Yep, absolutely underway. Some of the most famous photos from the day of the storm, the one that everybody is familiar with was the big sinkhole that the car was in the bottom of on Skyline. That's already been filled. It's not perfect, but it's passable. The main roads in West Duluth, where we had 15 homes that had been completely cut off because of landslides, one of those has been filled, so those folks have access now. Within our community, the worst hit area is still Fond du Lac, our neighborhood right down by the St. Louis River, right down by Jay Cook State Park. They still are struggling. They still don't have access. They still don't have sort of a daily routine, but for much of the city, that's returned. So, the challenge becomes to take these temporary fixes and make them permanent. And I was meeting with our Director of Public Works yesterday. He said, I have 220 major projects, major restoration. That's not going to all happen within one construction season. And residents know that. And I commend people. They've been very great about being wonderful neighbors, but they've also been great about just understanding. We can't get this all done tomorrow. It's going to take time. It may take this season, next season, maybe even 2 years to sort of get everything back to normal, or hopefully even better than it was.
You're touching upon, or you spoke about some places that a lot of Minnesotans hold dear, Jay Cook State Park, et cetera. And ironically, we were talking off camera, just 2 days before these rains was Grandma's Marathon, one of the biggest events in that area. But now tourism is down approximately 30%, so can it be salvaged?
Well, and that's part of what we're trying to do right now is really get a message out there that yes, while we were hit, and areas that were hit hard, much of the community, it was left undamaged. In fact, the areas other than Jay Cook State Park that tourists are used to seeing were not damaged at all by this storm. So the worst thing we could have happen would be this second punch of a long decline in tourism and a sustained decline in tourism. And you're right, we've seen in our hotels and our restaurants about a 30% decline since the storm with cancellations and people not coming. So when folks outside Duluth say, what can I do to help? Number one, easily, don't cancel your plans to visit. And in fact, if you hadn't thought about it, now's a great time to come up. If you're one of those folks who said, I love Duluth in the summer, but can never get a room or a room I can afford, you can now. And the dollars generated from food and beverage taxes, from general sales taxes, those are dollars we're going to use to help rebuild. So if you love our community and you want to support us, just come visit. That's a great start.
Okay, Senator Roger Reinert, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Governor Mark Dayton is asking for a federal disaster declaration for the Duluth area, which he says is a near certainty. Minnesotans can expect a special legislative session shortly after FEMA completes its disaster analysis.
I talked with Senator Bach, I talked with Senator Senjum about setting up a bipartisan working group that was employed in 2010. It was most people consider the most effective response the states had to a crisis like this in recent memory. And I found it helpful with the stadium as well to have a bipartisan group of legislators and staff members. And the goal would be to work on getting one bill that we could all agree on in advance, have, as we did last year before the special, I called the special session, a written agreement among the four legislative leaders, myself, that this will be the limits of the session and nothing else will be allowed, so it doesn't become a free-for-all. And on that basis, I'd call the session.
Senate Transportation Chair Joe Gimse will play a crucial role when that special session is called. He sat down with us to discuss that role and his thoughts on future transportation projects. Obviously, most people have seen the images coming from that area of the roads and the washed out roads. So, as Transportation Chair, how did you think about this and begin assessing the damages?
Well, right away, of course, we became concerned about safety and keeping traffic moving, of course, and also about the effects that it has on the people of Duluth and the surrounding areas. Certainly tourism is big for them up there, and we were very concerned that we kept the town open, if you will, and we reached out to Senator Reinert and asked him to give us an assessment, which he has done, and also officials in Duluth, and that there is a MnDOT district right there that has been very helpful in the process.
When you saw those images coming over the news, though, did you start thinking in terms of what can I do legislatively, or was that not even an issue at that point?
I think almost immediately when you're in a position like this, you start to think about that and how you can be helpful. And touring the site, the area around, and the damage, you get a picture of just what they're going through. And now, as we go through the process with the federal government and local officials of coming up with some solid answers as far as what the costs are going to be, I think the committees, Representative Beard in the House, myself, will be working very closely with MnDOT and the administration to find ways that we can expedite and move forward with the repairs on the roads.
So, Senator, when state funds are used for emergencies like this, do you find that other projects that are pending tend to fall a little bit lower on the radar because this is using up some funds?
Well, we have contingency funds that are available, and also we have a bit of a margin in our bonding capacity. So as we move forward with the repairs on this, we want to get the roads open, so there are temporary repairs being done as we speak. But to make the permanent repairs and to fix the roads as they were before, I think that we will have the capacity and the ability to do that without having a long-term effect on our ongoing priorities and projects.
Let's talk about some of those other projects. One is Highway 14 in Mankato. It's currently a 2-lane highway with a very high number of head-on collisions. Now, by waiting on the project, it was revived because there were some lower bids that came in. Is this a sign of the future, perhaps waiting on projects till something a little more that falls in and certain financial constraints comes in?
Well, I don't think that that's going to be the way that we're going to be evaluating programs. We have a very defined methodology when we look at all of our priorities across the state of Minnesota. I see this as a bit of an unusual circumstance in that it has risen to the top because of the safety aspects, because of the traffic aspects, and then also the economic development potential that is out there. We've held hearings both in the House and the Senate as late as the last week of session, brought in the Highway 14 folks to talk about that particular project. I was surprised at how quickly the governor moved on that, but we're going to keep a watchful eye on those types of things in the future.
Senator, the last time you were on Capitol Report, we were talking about the transportation bills as they currently sat just before they were about to be passed in the House and Senate. Mm-hmm. At that time, the Min-Pass 35E Min-Pass lane was still speculative. It didn't make it in the final package. Is it something that you would consider reviving if and when there's a special session or next session, or not at all?
Well, I don't think in this case where we're talking about disaster relief that would be the time or the place to revisit the Min-Pass concept. It's not really a concept anymore. It actually works and works very well. But at some point in time, I think we will be revisiting it, and certainly I'm very much in favor of that type of an approach because, again, it does work.
What are going to be some of your priorities if you are indeed Transportation Chair again next session?
Well, we have to go through the budgeting process again, and we will be looking at what the priorities are around the state and allocating those dollars to the 12 different areas that are under the purview of the Transportation Committee. And, that's quite a process. It's almost $5 billion that we work with. So,
are there any that stand out, though, that perhaps didn't make it into the packages in the past?
Well, we don't get parochial, I call it. We take a look at what the recommendations are from our area transportation partnerships and also MnDOT, and we use that to prioritize how we move forward with projects. We don't allow legislative interaction, and we hope for the most part that we don't have the administration prioritizing or earmarking projects, if you will. That's not something that we do. We typically take the projects that are in the queue, that have risen to the level that they should through the process, and fund them. But I do want to say that preservation and maintenance of what we currently have is going to continue to be a high priority for this Transportation Chair.
You serve on the Transportation Finance Advisory Committee as well, and it looks at the financing of roads, highways, bridges, as well as air, rail, and port facilities. Now, the group has a December deadline to submit its recommendations to the governor. Where are you in the process?
Well, we just met this past week and received the overviews from the metropolitan area, and we're getting past the overview stage where everybody is getting up to speed on just where the money is spent and how it's allocated within the different components of transportation. But I'm hopeful that we will start to talk about the ideas. I have ideas along with Representative Beard. We have a proposal for a corridor initiative that would allow corridor regions like Highway 14 to create a way of helping us help them fund their transportation needs, and I think it's a very good idea. We have some work to do on it, but within the next month or so, I think it'll be prepared to submit before the TFAC, as we call it, Transportation Finance Advisory Council, and see what their thoughts are. Have them brainstorm on it and help us to create a program that is a different way of looking at funding transportation in Minnesota, and I'm looking forward to that.
Will you wait until those recommendations are released before you start thinking in terms of the budgeting cycle for the next legislative session as far as different road priorities? Will these all marry together?
Well, I think that they will marry together. We have a December 15th deadline, I think by the middle of January, which is after the time when we'll come back into session. Some of those ideas will solidify. The ones that can work, will be on the table for additional consideration, and we'll have hearings on those ideas in our committee. So.
And finally, Senator, next session, as we've already mentioned, it is a budget session. Now, assuming that, we know that most of the transportation dollars are from dedicated funds. The last biennium, there was roughly $34 million, dedicated for different projects. What's your early assessment of how much money you might have to work with next session or for the next biennium, and will it be enough?
Well, as to whether it'll be enough or not is never enough. And but we're looking at alternatives and other ways of financing transportation. But beyond that, our funding is relatively steady with license fees, registration fees, gas tax. So we do know, with some certainty how much money will be coming in, and just allocating that properly to these preservation and maintenance efforts, and also the expanded and engineered design projects that increase, or I should say, decrease congestion are going to be very important and high priorities.
And real quickly, would you consider increasing any of these fees if necessary?
I'd like to see the TFAC group work through the process, see what kind of ideas they can come up with. I'm not, at first blush, in favor of increasing any of those fees, but letting this group do its work and see what they come up with and see if we can come up with some innovative ideas. Like I say, I have ideas that I want to share and move forward with, and hopefully we'll be able to come up with solutions that don't include additional tax increases.
Okay, Senator, we'll hopefully get you back on the program when you do craft some legislation. Until then, thank you again for joining us. We certainly appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Changes in healthcare will continue to move forward. In late June, the highly anticipated ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court on the Affordable Care Act was released. The High Court upheld the heart of the law, including these components: requiring individuals to be covered by health insurance, setting up healthcare exchanges, prohibiting insurance companies from disqualifying coverage for a pre-existing condition, giving small businesses tax credits for providing insurance to employees, and allowing more vulnerable adults to be covered by health insurance. Governor Mark Dayton says Minnesota has been hard at work setting up a health insurance exchange.
Everybody has joined together to work on this because we all agree that Minnesota can do it better for Minnesota than the federal generic model if we don't have it ready to go early next year. So, you know, both the Republican Senate caucus and the House caucus have declined to participate at all, and I would hope now that the law has been confirmed that they would choose to join it, and I will extend that invitation again to the Speaker and the Majority Leader.
Senate Chair of the Health and Human Services Committee, David Hann, continues to oppose the governor on the creation of a health care exchange, and he opposes more broadly the idea of a federal health care reform act. He joined us the day the ruling was issued to give his opinion. Senator, you've been a vocal opposition, very vocal opposition, leading really the effort statewide to oppose this federal Affordable Health Care Act. First of all, were you surprised by the Supreme Court's decision?
Well, in part, I was surprised by the fact that they discovered this to be a tax when the statute doesn't mention it as a tax. And in fact, the president and all the proponents were at great pains to say it wasn't a tax. And in fact, in the course of passing the bill, they made clear it wasn't a tax. I think it would have not passed, frankly, had they described it as a tax in the statute and in the course of passing it. So that was a surprise to me. But I think ultimately, those of us who oppose this law always believe that no matter what the court did, that there would be a need to have the political process weigh in. The public has to decide what kind of tax or what kind of healthcare policy we want to have, and whether we want the federal government to impose their excessive intrusiveness into personal decisions about healthcare, or whether we want those to be made by individuals, doctors, and the policy made at the state level. So I think from that perspective, this hasn't changed at all the requirement that this be ultimately decided by the people at the election booth.
There's so many facets to the Affordable Health Care Act. You know, we have the children who can be covered under their parents until they're age 26, et cetera. Are there any elements that stand out that you support? Well,
I think it's hard to agree with the things that it's hard for me to say I can support it, because I think the premise of the bill is so wrong-headed. The idea that by federal action that we can go in and do these things is really antithetical to not only the tradition we've had in this country, but as a practical matter, a way of doing it. We have always found in other areas, education, you name it, there's always been this tension and, in fact, problems with having the federal government come in and say, here's how you must do whatever it is that they're asking us to do. And when you're talking about health care, which is very personal, and to have this federal regimen dictate to us is hugely problematic. So it's hard for me to say, well, are there aspects of that you like? And I don't think so. I think the premise is so fatally flawed that it's hard to say that there's anything that I would like. Now, there are things about the current state of our healthcare system that do need reform, I agree that that is true, that we all can agree to that. But the remedy has to be something that is enacted locally, and I would argue has an emphasis on trying to make sure that we have a strong marketplace for consumers and individual families.
How do you think this Affordable Health Care Act will impact Minnesota?
Well, I think a lot of that depends on what the election does and whether or not the people ratify this through their votes at the polls or whether or not they reject it, depending on who we elect in the fall. But if we elect the same folks, if we keep things as they are, I think the first question will be what is the implication of these federal laws on things like the exchange, on things like health insurance? Is it going to be possible for people to retain health savings accounts? Is it going to be possible for people to continue to make their own choices with respect to health care or not? I think there's a lot of questions about this law that are not well understood, and because they haven't been yet implemented. But if this law stands and there's not an effort to repeal it in the Congress, then I think those questions will have to be addressed.
As chair of the Health and Human Services Committee, you, as I said earlier, you've been opposed to this act, but you've been very vocal in your opposition to a health care exchange. In the capacity you're in now, will you support it, or will you work to try to craft one that's positive for Minnesota?
Well, the first thing I would want to do is get the governor to talk about what it is that he's doing. He's got a group of people that he's paying millions of dollars of taxpayer money to act as a governing body for an exchange, but he has refused very directly to respond to any questions about what they're doing, what kind of policy he wants, what is he putting in place. He's
Questions from you?
Questions from our committee, questions in our committee to his representatives, Commissioner Rothman and others have been very, very clear about not responding to those kinds of questions. And so nobody knows. And I think that would be the first thing, is to find out what is the governor trying to accomplish. I don't think that we can do anything to enact an exchange without the help of the legislature, without something positively done by the legislature. And I think that before we do that, we want to know what the governor has been up to. And I think we need to look at what are the requirements under the federal law and whether or not it makes any sense to have a Minnesota version, or if in fact there really is no difference between what we can do as a state and what the federal law requires. And
again, as chair of this committee, how do you see your role, assuming you're in this position again next session, when it comes to beginning to implement and roll out other facets of the Health Care Act?
Well, I'm going to be continually looking for ways to preserve the independence of the state of Minnesota in their ability, and I believe it's a constitutional requirement that we retain our independence as a state. We are not an administrative unit of the federal government, and I think it's very important that we do everything we can to make sure that laws that affect the people of this state are written by people that are elected to govern this state. And I think that's going to be something we'll all have to work at.
Senator, my last question for you is, Minnesotans obviously are going to be asking a lot of questions about what this means to them. What do you think this means to them?
Well, I think it confronts the public with a very fundamental choice. What kind of government do they want to have? Do you want to have a government that is going to assume very broad, very expansive, very intrusive powers into very personal parts of our lives and turn over massive amounts of regulation and taxing authority? Or do we want to restore the idea that individuals, families have the ability to govern their lives? That to me is the ultimate question. I think that the public needs to ask themselves that when they go to the polls in the fall, and ask, are we electing people who are going to respect that, or are we electing people who are looking for further expansion of federal power?
Senator David Hann, with those words, thank you for joining us today. We
Thanks,
appreciate your time. Now this completes this week's Capitol Report. I'm Julie Bartkey from all of us at Senate Media Services. Thanks for watching.